So we're going to move into the Sobremesa part of the program this afternoon. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome Dr. Erica James and Miguel López up onto the platform. Remember the idea of the Sobremesa, it's this very informal conversation after a meal. And we were thinking as we were shaping the program about putting people together who didn't know one another, but we felt as though there were some potential synergies or overlaps in their practices. So I'm delighted to welcome Erica and Miguel onto the platform. Thank you.
I'm going to start. Thank you, Tilting Axis team, for inviting me to be a part of this, but also for encouraging me to get to know the work that Miguel is doing in Costa Rica, and just putting a lens on his work. When I was doing my research, my basic research on him, I just felt that we had a lot of synergies that, that almost made me miss the kind of a place like Theoretica, or wanting to be a part of a place like Theoretica, because I think in so many ways it is performing it has an ethical practice that I'm interested in, and I've always been interested in, even when I was involved with a national institution, but also as a thinker, as a fallen artist, as a person who is still very much committed to, in a sense, cultivating a kind of environment where artists flourish and ideas flourish and where artwork centers discourse. So I'm going to start with a question that has to do with something I've been very much interested in the past few years. And it's in 2016, you were given a really incredible honor, right? You were given an award for curatorial innovation. And that is something that I've been thinking about for the last few years. Like what is it that we can do as curators with the curatorial practice? How can we innovate? And one of the things I noticed in your practice is that you've looked towards innovation through certain ideas. You've brought in, and you've focused on feminist practices, the work of women, and you've also looked at queer practices. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think, talk specifically about feminist and queer theories, approaches in politics, and how those kinds of ideas have, in a sense, enabled a path towards curatorial innovation, or your idea of curatorial innovation.
Yes, thank you, Tilting Axis, for the invitation. I'm very honored to have this conversation with you, Erica. Well, yeah, the award was, the name was the Independent Vision Curatorial Award, and I was actually wondering why they gave me this award when I received it 2 years ago. But I think it is interesting how a curatorial work as mine, that is based on research, that has been most of the time. I'm from Peru. I grew up in Peru. I'm living in Costa Rica now, but I grew up in Peru between the 80s and the 90s. So I grew up in the middle of a very violent civil war between the state and the Maoist subversive group, Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso. So, I think growing up in a context of war shaped your subjectivity in a very specific way, And I think when I entered to university in early 2000s, and when I started doing art research in a way and writing, I was very confident about the power of aesthetics, creating a different space for discussion of some issues that in my specific context, as Peru, were difficult to talk about. So when I started to do some research about experimental art practices, I found that they were, creating another language to discuss about some, issues that were not interpreted in a plain way by other disciplines. I'm not saying that. I was just surprised about how much complex it is when you actually think about political violence, for example, using as a point of departure an artwork, because it gives you a lot of layers, and it doesn't give you exact answers or right answers. Usually, what the law and what the institutions wants to hear, like it's police. Is actually trying to define the exact positions, So actually, art was giving me at that moment, the chance to think my own experience in a more complex way. And I think at that earlier stage also, I was trained as an artist. I entered university to study literature, but I was expelled from the university at the second year, so I actually moved into something different. I was interested in understanding writing in a different way, so actually art gave me the chance to use words, So I was studying photography, and I remember that my first works as an artist were dealing about masculinity. The way I didn't recognize myself in this kind of normative ideal of men, and how I didn't have probably the language to process that, but I was seeing my works and my photographs and my installations at the moment, 18 years ago or 15 years ago, and I can recognize these kind of questions, and so I think I was just trying to exteriorize that, and when I found the tools, to understand that, I recognize how, the power of art, how art can help us to contribute to build a critical public sphere, and that's a very key aspect of my work as curator now. How the research that we do, the episodes that we recover, the practices that we are interested on, can help us, to reimagine the way we understand language, economy, democracy, power relations. So I'm trying to go into that direction,
So specifically talk about your work with, I think it was Grupo, is it Chacacayo? Chacacayo and Sergio Zavalos. There was something very, in just reading about the process of that and how that exhibition came about, the work came about, and what came as a result of that was really exciting to me, because it also reached into ideas on archive, but also queer aesthetics, lots of different things that I think reaches back into this notion of innovation. And can you just talk a little bit about, he's gonna ask me questions too, but, but I don't wanna miss this, because I really was drawn to this project and what it represented, because I thought it had some synergy with what we did with CQB.
Well, I found, I read about Grupo Chaclacayo when I had 19 years old. I was studying at the university at that moment, so I was very curious about their history, because they were active in Peru in the 80s in the context of this very violent war, and they left Peru in 1989, and they moved, the three of them, there was a group of three, Helmut Sota, a German artist, Sergio Ceballos, and Raúl Avellaneda, both of them Peruvian artists. Sergio and Raúl were students of Helmut, and they were working in 1982, 1983. Sergio and Raúl were studying at the university, and Sergio and Raúl quit the university, and they moved into this kind of abandoned house in the periphery of Lima City, and they work in this kind of they work in a way in isolation, but they were, of course, in dialogue with what was happening in Peru at that time. And they left Peru in 1989, and they actually took all the stuff with them. All the artworks, the paintings, the drawings, the photographs, and what they couldn't bring with them, they actually burned it in the backyard, and they actually took the ashes with them. So there was nothing in Peru. There was nothing at all. So when my first trip to Europe in 2007 to give a lecture in Germany, actually, so I contact one of them. So we met, and I was talking with Sergio. I remember having lunch in a Vietnamese restaurant. I was very convinced that that we need to recover this experience for Peru, because I truly believe that what they did at that moment, this kind of very, it was this very violent desacralization of religious iconography, like mixing, like images that were appearing in the newspapers, mixing them with homoerotic representations and abject, like photographs, and they were creating this kind of mix of pornography and images of the war. So how the possibility to look this material that were produced in Peru in the 80s, like 25 years after that, or 35 years after that, could help us to rethink, the role of gender and sexuality in the ways we interpreted the origins of the armed conflict, because usually the origins of the war between Shining Path and Peru is based on class struggle. It is based on the People's War that the Maoist group Shining Path declared against the state because they wanted to take down the bourgeois state. But of course, the way Shining Path understood social struggle was very colonized and very patriarchal and very heteronormative. So how can these queer performative practices that were produced in semi-clandestinity in the 80s could help us to understand that actually the basis of the war is the patriarchal structure, So it was clearly more complex than just class struggle. So I think, also recovering these materials create a situation to think about how our history has been written over these last decades, and how are a number of very important episodes that are not being accounted, that are not being recognized, and how can we create value around them, and what it means to create value around this very specific episode. And I think that's very important in terms of how do we see ourselves as curators, because for me, one of the most important aspects of role of curator is that, And if we recognize that our role is creating value around something, what is that, And I think for me that specific experience, that's very meaningful. Also because we're working, I actually met Sergio in 2007, we personally, and the exhibition happened in 2013. So we were working for, 6 years. And I think this is the time that to develop a serious, project.
Were you a part of an institution, or were you working on your own? How did this happen? How did you get to commit 6 years of your life?
I was working on my own. I had lucky because in 2008 in 2007 I received a grant from the Contemporary Art Museum of Barcelona. They were launching this independent study program that was very politicized and very radical in terms of critical theory. So I moved to Europe. So I lived in Europe between 2008 and 2009. And during that time, I traveled to Germany, several times. And then in 2010, I received a sort of like a residency from back in Utrecht, in Netherlands. So I lived in Netherlands for a while. So during that time, I was developing this research project, but I was on my own. I was independent, but I was creating the conditions, to discuss, to recover these materials, because it was quite slow to actually making the things travel back to Peru, and also create a sort of like intimacy, like a confidence, like creating a space of trust. Because when the Grupo Chaclacayo left Peru, they were accused of being sympathetic or being like being related to Shining Path, and that late 80s, this kind of accusation that was appearing in page article in a newspaper, it meant for these people, it could mean, like disappearance, or death. A lot of people were actually being persecuted in the 90s in Peru. So I, like how to build, like a project on trust, So.
Good.
Okay, I'm going to. I wanted to ask you about. Maybe we can continue in this conversation about queer and feminist issues because when I learned about the Caribbean Queer Visualities project, I was really amazed about the work you were doing and how much research you developed and the publication the digital publication that you had online now. You have online. So I was curious about how this idea came about. I mean, how did you start to think about creating like a network of scholars, artists, activists around queer visualities?
Oh boy. I'm a part of a collective. I'm a professor, but I'm a part of a collective called Small Acts. And Small Acts is a critical forum that's focused on the Caribbean. And as part of the editorial board, we literally come together and try to figure out where are we going to go next? What needs to be examined? Where do we need to, in a sense, put our attention to in terms of scholarship on the Caribbean? And for me, at one of these meetings, I decided, for a little while, I had been really observing what was happening in the region in terms of the arts. And one of the places that I found that no one was talking about, like this art was in plain sight many years ago, and it continued working with artists. And basically, we chose artists to produce new work that engaged the theme and would lead us in the conversation. And then we chose writers who would be able to engage the work on the page, so that these artists would not just be producing work and have it fall flat, or we expect it to speak for itself, but that there would be interlocutors, that there would be people working directly with them, having conversations with them, talking through process, speaking through materiality, and through that we would then produce the scholarship, but that the artists themselves would direct that. And so I'm resistant to framing, or the idea of framing, and even though I'm an art historian and we do it all the time, I'm resistant to it. And so we were talking about organic, something like, is there a way for us to, in a sense, not frame, but have the conversation emerge? And how can we, in a sense, put the attention on the art and think of the art, like I said, as a theoretical form to, in a sense, guide the conversation, this very complex conversation that we wanted to have around a queer visual practice in the Caribbean. And we would say this, we didn't always know what we meant by it. And I'm okay with that. I'm not someone that I think I need to know everything about something before I propose. I'm interested in searching. I'm interested in grappling with ideas, and I think it's a useful form. And we're going to talk a little bit about that because it's almost a part of your platform at your institution, which I really admire. But that's, in a sense, that's how it happened. And we had two conversations. One was at Yale in 2014, where we had the artists come, half of them come and half of the writers come. They met each other and just started to talk. And it was a very intimate talk. It was very bare. I mean, it was unusual. It wasn't very formal in a sense that everyone was guarded. In fact, it was a very unguarded space, which I found interesting and fresh. Because there was less of a performance of what we imagined it should be, and more of a listening, more of an exploration, and so it kind of evolved from there. And it evolved into the catalog, which became a bigger catalog with 10 new critical essays by writers from across the United States and the world, the global Caribbean. It involved new work by one of my favorite artists from the Dominican Republic, Jorge Pineda was one of them. Hello, Jorge. But just really important work, we thought. And of course, we ended up working with Anna Lee Davis and the British Council to do exhibitions of this work. work in Belfast and other places, and hopefully we'll do more of it. I don't know, but I think it stimulated a conversation. It stimulated a discourse in a way where it's not the final word. That's not what we're interested in, or being the only voice in the conversation, but kind of generating conversations. And part of that, growing a kind of relational practice in a way, was about who we invited to write. Because in some cases, they were also interested in the questions, and they have produced texts, and they've gone on to produce really important work about these ideas and brought it to bear in whatever discipline they were working from. And some of them were anthropologists, some of them were Black feminist theorists, some of them were art historians, some of them were trained in other fields, literary, writers, poets, and so we're interested in those kinds of interlocutors and sort of widening the points of departure and vision for these ideas.
I really like the idea of putting, the artist at the center, and how, what you said about providing theoretical models. I think is fantastic way of understanding curatorship. And I just remember now when you were talking that when we were exchanging some ideas with Annalie a couple of years ago, she mentioned it about the desire of actually organizing a sort of like a large exhibition, to travel around the Caribbean. But she also mentioned how difficult it was to imagine something like that. So I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the difficulties to conceive an exhibition or project like this? Yeah.
I mean,
in the Caribbean. Yeah.
Well, there were great difficulties in terms of bringing an exhibition like that to the Caribbean. It still hasn't arrived, right? We had to have it in Belfast, Ireland, and Glasgow, and places very far afield, and which is something that bothers me, and I'm still, and of course there are cultural reasons for that. Which institutions would be able to do that safely? Which institutions would be willing to take that on, given the kind of conservative bent that's very clear, especially in the English-speaking Caribbean, and we never figured that out. We still haven't figured it out. And then small acts, we're a little collective, and even though we encouraged artists to make work that was transportable, reproducible, they could do whatever they wanted, but it had to travel. The work had to travel a little easier than us, renting or trying to ship things in a big plane. So even though we had that, what was missing in a sense is the cultural terrain. There needs to be more work within the cultural terrain, or how can we think again in an innovative way to curate beyond a physical space, or to produce work that doesn't need articulation within a particular gallery space? Is it possible for us to use the internet? Is it possible to use different models or contemporary ways of creation or communication to produce work around these ideas that that can, in a sense, bypass some of the problematics of space? And the implication of a particular national space. So we tried to, this was our first step into trying to think through those problems, but we just, we ran out of steam, I guess. And, but it's something that I'm still trying to think through, because I think we're an archipelago. I think it's Dominica, where I was standing on the shore of Dominica and looking over to Martinique and realizing I couldn't just go there, that I had to go somewhere else to come back to get here, to get there. We have those kinds of odd moments and odd places. So it's not easy to just create and move. Movement itself is in the fifth dimension in the Caribbean. You have to move all over the place to get where you need to go. So yeah, but it did provide an opportunity for us to start to at least think beyond spatialities and beyond just having things on a wall. And what does this region demand of us in terms of curatorial innovation to sort of do the work that we want the work to do, so yeah. So in terms of that, let's talk a little bit about, how are we doing? Okay. let's talk, I guess we can go back to this, because I'm interested in a couple of concepts that I think ground your work that, in a sense, goes back to institution building. And we were talking about institutions. And I was an artist as well. I'm a fallen artist, so it's kind of, I didn't know you were. That started that way. But what I'm also, I was also drawn to in your work is the fact that you believe in archive. And you think of archive as an essential part of the work. You came up, you developed a, you have this publication project. I'm very grateful to have these. Thank you very much. But I want you to talk about what archiving means. And do you think of it as an essential part of curation? Or your curation, or what your idea of curation is. When I started out with the gallery, I always knew that for the Caribbean, we could not look in one direction, that our work was never going to be about the present or the future, that it had to be a Janus head. You know, it had to look back, forward, and in a sense, in our present, all simultaneously. So talk a little bit about your work. I think you talked about it at the last Tilting Access, but summarize it in this instance, but also talk about it in a way that it connects to maybe your work with RBC. I think it's called RBC.
Right, yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think what we produce when we do research is archive. I mean, it is very organic. I think I realized archive was part of my life when I actually started to visiting the library, to looking for documents from the 60s and 70s, and then I was photocopy them and archiving them, you know, and trying to organize, like, trying to think them. And I think it was very organic. As I said, my first curatorial project that I can call mine, it was in 2007, and it was a revision of the experimental practices in Peru in the 60s and the 60s and 70s. And most of the material that we exhibited at that time was actually photographs and documents that we extracted from the library and from, you know, like Personal's archive, because most of the works were destroyed. So, you know, like the archive actually gave us the possibility to reconstruct a part of a history that was totally invisible. You know, actually most of the images, 90% of the images that we show at that moment in Peru were never reproduced in any book, in any art history book, in any catalog. So I think for everybody, for the art community in Lima that saw the show, it was like discovering, you know, like something that they never thought it could exist. So actually, and I thought, yeah, I mean, this is very powerful in terms of how can you rewrite the whole history. So at that same year, I was invited to a symposium in Barcelona at the MACBA, and then I was already working with some scholars from Argentina, from Brazil, that I met 1 year after that. And then we decided to work together, and we founded a sort of collective, a network at the end, that we call the Southern Conceptualisms Network. And it was a network that was intended to basically create a space for dialogue, you know, like between us in terms of what were the dangers of disappearance of some artist archives because of the art market, because at that moment, 1 decade ago, there was this kind of interest of from the market of conceptual art practices. So a lot of like artist archives were started to be dismembered, you know, like they were like being sold like by individual pieces of paper. And that was a very, you know, like delicate situation, because some of these people were, for us, like a reserve of the critical memory, you know. I mean, most of these people were very active during times of political repression. So most of them were actively fighting against dictatorships, you know. And they were, of course, developing experimental strategies to do this. I mean, they were doing intervention in public spaces, you know, they were creating like alternative networks using mail posts, for example, you know, like mail art, this kind of stuff. So we were thinking, I mean, it is not just about like we are at risk of losing part of the like a part of our history, but it's more complex than that. It's just this material. It is important to think about the democracy itself. What it means to live in a democracy, or to create a public debate about a broad public debate, that involves civil society about what were the effects of those, authoritarian regimes and military dictatorships. So I think we were just creating the conditions to discuss about it and to put to bring back this discussion about archives into the collective debate of the art community, and we were contributing in that sense. And also we started to work with local institutions, like the Universidad de la República in Montevideo, for example, to ask them to help us to allocate the archive of very important Uruguayan artists like Clemente Padín. The archive is in bad conditions. It's like he lived with his family, and we are at risk of losing this material. How can we work together? An institution and a group of researchers and scholars, how can we work together to make this available for everyone, accessible, to create a research plan, to ask for money, for fundings, to implement an adequate system of organization, of cataloging, so. I think we just started to think how to create alliances, between civil society and institutions.
But you're working across national. You're not in the same country, right?
Yeah, no, exactly. I missed that. The network is composed of more than 50 people that came from different countries. So that makes the work very dynamic, because we can work in different places at the same time, and we can create like small alliances. Like, for example, I'm working with the Lima Art Museum in Peru, the Mali, and we receive on loan, which will be a donation at the end, of a very important archive of a Peruvian artist who was living in Peru between the 60s and early 80s, and they moved to Switzerland. So he took all his archive with him. So yeah, we are recovering this material and creating like a research programs around it. So yeah, we are working in different places, and also I think something that is very interesting about archive and curatorial practice is how archive can actually give you the chance to create narratives that go beyond, like the traditional names, or the traditional frameworks. You can actually create like transversal, like accounts and possibilities to think what happened, and I think that's very, very special.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because you bring about, you introduce this word tradition, and when I started working in the Bahamas again, I was confronted by what people thought tradition was, and how that was such a singular, determined story. And that anything we did to sort of challenge that notion of tradition was almost met with a bit of resistance. So part of the work was deconstructing what was accepted as the story or the narrative, to do some pulling apart, or in some cases just nudging, because in some cases people weren't ready. So yeah, that's a very powerful position. So where does in terms of an archive, we sort of think of it having a home, and then a kind of life that can live beyond it. So you're working in a system that is beyond nation. It's not a national system. It's working outside of those frameworks, and it's very relational. Is there a home for the archive, and how is it then utilized by the 50 members and the communities that they reach and touch? How is the archive kept, but also then mobilized or used?
I think that, the idea was to actually secure or to create the conditions for local archives to stay in their own places, because like in the last decade or decade and a half, there were some interest of universities from abroad to buy this archive, and of course they offer them, offer the artists better conditions and money, But the idea of actually moving this material from from South America to the US, for example, it took us the possibility to actually create, a local discussion and to give access to local audience. So it's not that we are creating one single archive. It's just like we are trying to support, local initiatives in various cities. And I think, it is just an attempt to offer them for creating new historiographies, new narratives. It's not for us. It's just like,
So is it digitally available to everybody?
in some cases, we are digitizing the materials, and we have actually a web called archivosenuso.org, archivesinuse.org, it's in Spanish, and you can actually access the materials through the web. And depending on what museum is working on this, is giving them more access, public access in the library, for example. So it's not one single model. It's like like the context in a way shape, the model, the needs shape the model.
Yeah, good. I understand that.
And maybe also we
to wrap up.
Yeah, we're closing.
You have to give us one. Each.
But because I really wanted to ask Erica about the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, because I think it's a very, very interesting model as an institution. And I would say that there are two aspects that I really like, and I admire deeply. I mean, how do you create an institution that is in a way free of government influence, or or kind of, and how do you work to cultivate the support of the community? I mean the idea that the institution has to be founded on transparency and accountability. I think that's very, very interesting. And you were the founding director of this institution in 2003, so that was 15 years ago. And
oh gosh, yeah, wow. I've been gone almost as long as I was there. This is a conversation actually we started having over lunch about national institutions and institutions in the region, which I'm particularly interested in, and I was always interested. I think I was telling you yesterday. For some reason, I was always interested in institution building in the Caribbean. I designed a National Art Gallery of the Bahamas as my senior project in college, not knowing that it would ever happen, But I was already there, I was thinking about this. And 10 years later, I got a call. Do you want to be involved with are you kidding me? Of course I want to be involved. But we looked, I should say that Patrine Archer-Straw, the late Patrine Archer-Straw, was a fundamental part of the formation of the National Art Gallery. She sort of brought a certain kind of awareness, because it was always about educating the supporters and the power brokers, the people that we needed to put this in place, or to give us the structure in which to do the work that we wanted to do. So, and she came with a certain kind of ethics that, in a sense, grounded us in a way, so that when we started to have conversations about what my role would be, when they really realized, oh, we have a building now, we may actually be able to open this, and we need someone on the ground, and they called me, we had conversations about what that meant and what kind of policies could be in place. And we looked at a lot of institutions around the region. Barbados was working on their national art gallery, and they were doing lots of work behind the scenes, but we didn't have time to do all of that work, right? But we had the space. They didn't have a space. So we were like, okay, we have the building, but we can't do that work. But what can we do? And what kind of, what are we walking into? what is the knowledge base of this community and the expectations of this community in terms of what a national institution provides. And one thing I quickly realized that in the Bahamas, a lot of people thought it should be all things to all people. And I knew it wouldn't survive trying to, in a sense, be everything to everybody. And in a sense, it had to find its balance. It had to find, really be attentive and attuned to what the community needed at that particular moment, but it also had to be attuned to the kind of larger regional, international space and historical space in which this institution was being born. Museums and galleries are very class-based, elitist, 19th century colonial spaces, right? And here we are in a post-independence, post-colonial Caribbean society thinking about doing this thing. How could we create an institution that was, in a sense, in tune, using these tools, because we are of the West, even though we are treated as outside of the West, we are at the same time simultaneously of the West. So this form is our form as well. So how do we then take that form and not think of it in terms of a monument, but think of it as something that can be broken apart and reformed to meet our needs, as a thinking kind of space that could cultivate the kind of intellectual space that artists could thrive. So that's how we began, and for some reason, I can't tell you why the government went along. I mean, the government, I can't, some things you just can't explain, and I really can't explain that. And we're famous for flipping governments, so you know that you may not have the same government over the course of a long time. And for me, I think when I got there in January of 2003, it was one government. By the time we opened in July, it was a different government. And that was a lesson, because you have to, in a sense, go at it immediately as your own thing, as something separate from your government. And formally we aligned it as a corporation and not a government department or institution. So it had its own. It was autonomous in a way. It was autonomous. It was funded by the government, but institutionally, it was an autonomous body. And so we had a lot of flexibility into, in a sense, shape and we also got incorporated in Parliament. So we're an institution that is, that is on the record. They can't just close us just like that. We established a board that owned the building, owned the grounds, owned it separate from the government. So there's a certain, it's a quasi-government institution, but it's in the Bahamas, you're still government. What does that mean? Nothing good, right? So we almost had to, in a sense, establish it around a certain kind of ethics, and an ethics that was, in a sense, antithetical to what people understood as government. So we had to be transparent. Money every dime had to be accounted for. I made sure I didn't have anything to do with it. Money. No one was going to accuse me of anything. But I made sure that everything was accounted for, but I never handled anything directly. I didn't want any sort of idea of corruption or impropriety, all of those things that may be associated from government. We set up structures to prevent those things from happening. We made the books, we got audited every year, and anyone could come and see it. So a level of transparency from the beginning that was anti-government, just isn't what the government does in that country. It may seem simple, but we got a very historical building that was very tied to a colonial moment, and we needed to take care of it. Another aspect of government is that you don't take care of your public buildings. We were pristine, painted, and we repaired things. I mean, and it seems simple, but we had to appear as something else, something new, a kind of fresh wind in this culture that we knew we were entering into. And then we had to try to expand the mindset. Not in a sense say tradition isn't real, because those paintings of beach scenes and palm trees and poincianas, that's a part of the story, right? But to contextualize that within a larger, more complicated narrative and introduce other narratives. So looking back, I think people didn't even notice that the first 3 exhibitions the ones that I curated were not about those ideas, but they were about charting a different kind of narrative. In a very subtle way, we never said, this is what we're doing. We just kind of did it. And it kind of unfolded, knowing that we were just contributing to a larger story or kind of expanding to a larger story. But before Annalie, I'm not even going to look at Annalie because I have to ask you, no, Annalie, this is important. This guy, I was in charge of a very top-down institution where I was the director and chief curator, but I love the form of teoretica. And I want him to talk about it because one of the reasons, there are 2 reasons. This organization that Miguel works with, oh gosh, I have to give me a moment here. They are committed, this is I don't know, I had chills. They are committed to cultivating an institution, they're committed to theory, ethics, and aesthetics. And they're an institution that has in their raison d'etre that they are committed to, having a community that casts doubt, questioning, debate, generation. And I thought that was the most fabulous thing, right? Doubt. Because there's so much potential in that, right? There's so much possibility. There's something generative about questioning and being doubtful. And to be a part of an institution like that, and to be, come from Peru. I mean, we're curators that move around in this region. You're operating in a place that you're not from. So in a sense, this is about an ethos that you shared with an institution that was run by what I understood as a very strong personality within this community. And you came into it 3 years ago? Mm-hmm. 3 years ago, and things kind of, what happened? What happened, and where is doubt in this, how does doubt sort of, in a sense, what does that allow for in the community that you serve? And that's it. That's all.
Well, Teoretica was founded by Virginia Perez Raton. Some of you maybe met her. That was in 1999. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking, when you were talking about the National Gallery, how important it is to build institutions. And that was she actually did. She, before founding Teoretica in 1999, she founded the first contemporary art museum in Central America. It was the museum that exists in San Jose. She was the first director, and that was in 1994. Mm-hmm. And after that, she left. She quit in 1998 because she was a bit tired of the bureaucracy, and the state thing. But she was smart enough to actually to create the space of autonomy for the museum. I mean, the museum, the Contemporary Art Museum in San Jose, is not dependent of the Ministry of Culture, It has its own board that decides about the director and this kind of stuff. So it creates the autonomy for the museum to work well. I think that's very important. So she quit the museum and she founded Teoretica. And that's a very important gesture for me because it is clear that she was trying to create an ecosystem. And I mentioned that yesterday. I know how important it is for us to build infrastructure, that I think when you work as an independent curator, it's quite easy to miss that, to actually to forget that your work is to build infrastructure, in different ways, but that is the mission that you have. And I mean, I was appointed 3 years ago, and it was interesting because at that moment, Teoretica was in a process of change. I mean, it was very subtle, I was quite slow, maybe at that moment, but it was in a process of change in terms of how to reinvent the institution. Virginia passed away in 2010, and after that, Teoretica was closed for a year, more or less, and then the institution started to reconstruct itself, the whole structure, because because Theoretica was Virginia and Virginia was Theoretica. This kind of equation, and I think it is interesting to think how this new moment of Theoretica is actually built an institution, but, like new positions, and new ways of working. Theoretica needed to be rebuilt, after Virginia's past. So Inti Guerrero was the first artistic director after that, and he was artistic director and curator for 3 years, but he never lived in Hong Kong. And I think there was it was quite difficult for the local art community, to deal with the idea that the institution had a director that didn't live in Costa Rica but somewhere else. So I think it was this kind of transitional process. I think Inti did an amazing job in terms of putting Theoretica back on the map, creating international collaborations, looking for grants, this kind of stuff. And when I arrived, there was a time when Theoretica didn't have any kind of artistic director. So I think that moment was very special for the people who was working in the institution, because give them the chance to invent their own content, Because when I was appointed, I think the institution expected from me to feel that, to produce all the contents and all the exhibitions and publications and this kind of stuff. And we are in this kind of transition now, when we were questioning how the power is centralized in one single person, in one single director or chief curator, and we have now a co-directorship. We are 5 co-directors, and we are sharing responsibilities, and we are sharing the activities and the.
Repeat that.
We are.
There are 5 co-directors.
Yeah. We are 5 co-directors, and I think that's very important for us. It's working very well. A lot of people asked us a lot about how it works, but it worked very well because it's very organic. It is not just changing the hierarchy. It's actually changing the whole way we work in the institution. It's not like you have a director that says, okay, you have like $3,000 and you have that for your project. No, we are actually producing our own budget. We're our own needs, and we are discussing all together how to allocate the money, collectively, in the project that we think is important for the institution. And I think it is for me, was also a lesson in terms of how to rethink the role of the curators, because I think curators are usually being educated to think about their job as concentrating power, that you have to concentrate all the power and all the decisions, this kind of stuff. And it's very competitive in that aspect. But what we are actually doing is questioning that there is one single person that has all the answer, and also the idea that the surviving of the institution depends on one person again.
Yes.
It doesn't depend on one person, because if it works in that direction, it is not going to work.
It's not going to live, right?
Exactly, it's not going to live. So I also think about what we are doing now, as we are learning all together how to lead an institution, And so, we can all at some point be we can imagine other institutions, and we are also asking, out loud, how do we organize? What is the role? What is the public role of an institution? What is the relationship between the institution and the local art communities? How to be more open, more flexible, more dynamic, So I think it's very, very amazing in terms of learning. It is this kind of collective learning.
I do too. And on that note, before she